In Chapter 22, we're going to discuss evolution. The way your book describes it is defined as descent with modification. First, we're going to have an introduction to the idea of evolution, and then we're going to look at a historical view of evolution, including Darwin and many of the scientists who influenced his thought. As I said, your book defines evolution as descent with modification. Evolution can be as simple as very rapid changes in the genetic makeup of a population over time. It can happen in as quick as one generation, or it can be as complex as transformation of one species into a new species, or one species splitting into two. So evolution can be short-term, small changes in a population, or very large changes over time that can create new species. The idea of evolution allows us to see how all living organisms today are descendants of a common ancestor. We'll discuss that a lot in the next several videos and also in Chapter 26. Evolution also gives us a scientific explanation for many phenomena that we see. For example, the ways that organisms are very well suited for their environments. It gives us an explanation for why there are so many shared characteristics of life, even in diverse species. And it also explains why there are so many different organisms on the earth. If we want to look at an example of how organisms are well suited for their environments, you can see that in this image of a moth that looks just like a dead leaf. It is extremely well camouflaged. So here's the moth, extremely well camouflaged against its background, which makes it much more difficult for a predator to see. Therefore, it has a good chance of surviving to be able to reproduce. When we look at evolution giving us an explanation for the unity of life, one great example is when you look at the structure of cilia across all living things. So Paramecium is a single-celled protist, and they have these tiny little cilia on the outside of their bodies, outside of their cell, which allow them to move. We have cilia also found in humans in the windpipe or trachea. What the cilia of the windpipe do is they force debris that we breathe in. It sweeps those debris back out through our trachea so that we can cough them up. So while these two structures, they're both cilia, but they're found in extremely different organisms, a single-celled protist versus a human. But if we look at the cilia cross-section of a Paramecium and of the cilia found in windpipe, we can see that the structure is almost identical. So evolution can explain why those structures are so similar between a protist and a human. Even more compelling is the idea that all living things, protists, plants, fungi, animals, everyone, bacteria, everyone has the exact same genetic material. We all have the exact same code that produces genes and produces proteins. So this is great evidence that evolution can show us how all life is connected. Evolution also gives us a good explanation for the diversity of life. So these are all of the different domains, 3 different domains of life. We have domain bacteria, domain archaea, and domain eukarya. This is where most of the organisms are that we are most familiar with. All of these organisms, according to the theory of evolution, have evolved from one common ancestor billions of years ago. And as we look at how evolution occurs, we can see how one species can split into 2, and over millions and millions of years, we can see how we get new species that are very different from their ancestors. Again, this topic will be covered in chapter 22 and also in chapter 26. So let's talk about the historical background of evolution. We have all heard that Charles Darwin is the father of evolution, but where did he come up with his ideas? He didn't just come up with everything on his own. There were a lot of scientists and philosophers working before him that led to Darwin coming up with his theory. One such person is Carl von Linné. He was also he called himself Carolus Linnaeus, so both of these are the same people. Lived around the 1750s, and he was the first person to introduce taxonomy. Taxonomy is the naming, defining, and classifying of groups of biological organisms on the basis of shared characteristics. Now, Linné did not have any notion that organisms or species were related to one another. He was just grouping them based on how similar they were. In his time, the idea was that all species were specifically made by God, that they were fixed and unchangeable. So while he grouped organisms into groups that were similar to one another, he did not make any claims about whether or not they were related to each other. The other really important thing that Linnaeus did was he developed the binomial nomenclature that we still use today to identify all different species. So when we give the scientific name of a species, what we're doing is giving the genus and the species. So Homo sapiens is humans, and we all belong to the genus Homo, and the sapiens is the species name. So that is how Carolus Linnaeus contributed to how we understand organisms by grouping them together by their similarities. Another important scientist in around 1800 was John Baptiste de Lamarck. Lamarck had the very controversial idea that species were not fixed, that they underwent evolutionary change, but he did not understand the mechanism. So he had some right ideas, but his misunderstanding was in that he thought that species changed through the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Here's an example of that. We often use giraffes to illustrate Lamarck's idea. So in the example of giraffes, if a giraffe reaches up during its lifetime a whole lot to reach leaves that are high up in a tree, that its neck will grow the more it uses it, the more it stretches it. And for giraffes that don't reach up to get leaves at the top of trees, they don't use their necks, they don't stretch their necks as much, and so they do not acquire a longer neck. Lamarck thought that by stretching your neck, you could make your neck longer, and then you could pass that trait down to your offspring. So that is not the way inheritance works, but it was a good guess or a good theory when we didn't have any other explanations. Another idea that Lamarck came up with that was controversial was that spontaneous generation of the most simplest forms of organisms could happen. So if you just let a glass of water sit out, that eventually something living would be in it. And he thought that was just spontaneous generation of a new organism. He didn't understand that microscopic organisms could have already been in there. One really important person for Darwin's development of his theory of evolution was Thomas Malthus. In the early 1800s, Thomas Malthus wrote a book that described human struggle for existence. It's interesting that Malthus was so influential to Darwin, since Malthus was not even a biologist, he was an economist. So his idea was that humans produce more offspring than the environment can support, and therefore there is extreme competition over resources. If you look at this graph down here, this should say time. I'm not sure if you can see the x-axis, but over time, human population grows, and at some point they reach a point of crisis where not all of the humans who are alive can survive. So His idea was that not everyone can survive and that humans run out of resources. Charles Lyell, in around 1830, wrote Principles of Geology. In this book, he described natural processes that changed the earth, including land masses being created and being destroyed through natural processes like volcanoes and land masses moving. So this was another one of these ideas that was extremely controversial during the time because the earth was thought of as completely unchanging. He also put forth that the earth is very, very old, billions of years old, not a couple of thousands of years old, like the idea that was most accepted at the time. So if we look at this timeline, there's a lot of other folks here who were also very influential for Darwin, but here we have Malthus's Principle of Population, where he's talking about the struggle for existence. Here we have Lamarck publishing his ideas on how species can change. These are all very controversial ideas. Lyell publishes his Principles of Geology, explaining that the earth is ever-changing and that it's very, very old. And here you see Darwin traveling around the world on the Beagle, which is the boat that he was on when he traveled to lots of different areas, including the Galapagos Islands. Here we have Darwin writing an essay, which he did not publish. And over here we have Wallace, who you should have heard about in your video, and Wallace and Darwin getting together up here and working together. So Darwin wrote on the origin of species, and it outlined the mechanism for evolutionary change, and he stressed the importance of variation within a population, which gives the material basically for natural selection. Wallace also developed the same idea of evolution by natural selection, and he published a joint paper with Darwin in 1858. So Darwin was able to come up with his idea of evolution by natural selection by using a lot of different information. First of all, he observed small differences between species that seemed to make it easier for them to survive and reproduce in whichever environment they were. These are called adaptations. He didn't really know how to explain adaptations, so he took a bunch of information, not just from his observations, but also from Malthus, The Struggle for Existence, Lyell, that the earth is very old and constantly changing. He used Lamarck's idea that species can change, and then his own observations that there are lots of different forms of similar species differently suited for different environments. And he used all these to come up with his idea of natural selection. So in the next video, we'll talk about how natural selection works, what the mechanisms are, and some examples as well.